I found a breach in the perimeter fence.
For 6 weeks, security patrols at a major airbase kept filing the same report about the same woman. Mid-50s, disheveled, walking the outer perimeter fence line at odd hours, talking to herself, never approaching the gate, never causing trouble, just walking. Every single patrol that spotted her wrote the same word in their log: transient. 6 weeks of being written off as background noise, as someone the base didn't need to think twice about. Then, on a foggy Thursday night, that same woman flagged down a patrol vehicle, pointed to a specific section of fence line, and described in precise technical language that stopped the young airman in his tracks exactly how someone could breach that base's perimeter without tripping a single sensor. 4 hours later, base security discovered she was right, down to the exact panel. And by morning, 3 separate agencies wanted to know how a woman they'd been calling homeless for 6 weeks had just found something their own systems had missed entirely. If you love stories where the person everyone stopped looking at twice turns out to be the one who was actually paying attention, hit subscribe before we go any further, because that's the whole engine of this channel. And tonight, I want you thinking along with me. Somewhere in this story, you're going to start suspecting who she really is and why she was really out there. When it clicks, stop and put your guess in the comments before I tell you. Let's rewind 6 weeks, because to really understand what happened on that fence line, you need to understand exactly how thoroughly that base had already decided who she was, long before anyone bothered to actually ask her. Her name for tonight's story was Diane Whitlow, 56 years old, and I want to start by being honest with you about something, because I think it changes how this story lands. Diane wasn't performing homelessness. She wasn't in disguise. When security patrols first started noticing her walking that perimeter road 6 weeks earlier, what they saw genuinely did look, on the surface, like a woman in some kind of personal crisis. Worn jacket, a backpack she carried everywhere, a tendency to mutter under her breath as she walked, the kind of behavior that, to a tired patrol running the same loop for the 4th time that shift, reads instantly as something to note and move past, rather than something to actually investigate. The first patrol that spotted her filed a standard report. Unhoused individual, no apparent threat, monitored from a distance, no action taken. That report became the template for every single report that followed it over the next 6 weeks, because that's how institutional memory works sometimes. Once a pattern gets established, once a label gets attached, most people stop looking freshly at the thing in front of them and just start confirming what the last report already told them to expect. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I think it's one of the more uncomfortable truths this story is going to ask you to look at. How many times in your own life have you looked at someone and let a single, surface-level assumption do all the thinking for you? Hold that thought. We're going to need it. What none of those patrols knew, because nobody had ever actually stopped to have a real conversation with her, was that Diane Whitlow had spent nearly 20 years working as a civilian security systems engineer, specializing specifically in perimeter intrusion detection for high-security government and military installations. She wasn't some peripheral hobbyist with an internet fascination. She had, for 2 decades, been one of the people trusted to design, test, and audit the exact kind of sensor networks and fence-line security systems that bases like the one she was now walking past every night actually relied on. And here's the part of this story that I think makes it land so much harder once you understand it. 8 months before she ever showed up at that fence line, Diane had lost her position at the contracting firm she'd worked for, in circumstances that had nothing to do with her competence and everything to do with a round of budget cuts that swept through her division with the kind of blunt, indifferent efficiency that ends careers regardless of how good the people in them actually are. She'd spent the following months searching for work in an increasingly specialized, increasingly small field, watching her savings shrink, watching her housing situation destabilize in exactly the slow, grinding way that job loss quietly turns into homelessness for people whose skills, however genuinely exceptional, don't always translate quickly into a new paycheck. She'd ended up, through a chain of circumstances that had nothing dramatic about them, without stable housing, staying in a shelter across town, and walking, most nights, because walking was one of the only things left that felt like it was still hers to control. And the specific stretch of road she found herself walking most often happened to run alongside that base's outer perimeter fence, not because of anything she was planning, but simply because it was a long, quiet stretch where she could think without being bothered. Except, here's the thing about spending 2 decades of your professional life studying exactly how perimeter security systems are supposed to work. You don't stop seeing it, even when you're not looking for it anymore. Diane, walking that fence line night after night for 6 weeks, wasn't consciously auditing anything at first. But somewhere around week 3, according to her own account given much later, something started nagging at her. The specific professional itch of a trained eye noticing a pattern that didn't quite sit right, even from outside the fence. Here's what she'd actually noticed, pieced together over those weeks through nothing more than careful, repeated observation from a public road. A specific section of that base's perimeter fence, running along a stretch where the terrain dipped slightly, and tree cover from an adjacent property partially obscured the sightline from the nearest guard tower, had a sensor coverage gap that, to someone who genuinely understood how those systems were engineered, was almost invisible unless you knew precisely what you were looking for. The sensors themselves were functioning exactly as designed. The problem wasn't a malfunction, it was a design blind spot, the kind of gap that exists not because anyone made a mistake, but because sensor placement decisions made years earlier, for reasons that made sense at the time, had left a narrow seam that newer construction on the neighboring property had since made considerably more exploitable than anyone maintaining that system currently understood. Diane noticed it the way only someone with her exact background could have noticed it, from a public road, at night, with nothing but her own trained eye and 2 decades of pattern recognition that 6 weeks of homelessness hadn't managed to take from her. For a while, she genuinely didn't know what to do with what she was seeing. She had no formal way to report it. She had no ID that would get her past a gate to speak to anyone with the authority to actually listen. And there's a specific, painful detail in her account of those weeks that I think deserves to be said plainly. She'd tried, once early on, to flag something to a passing patrol vehicle, and the patrol, seeing exactly what 6 weeks of reports had already trained them to see, had simply told her to move along, not unkindly, but without any real engagement either. After that, she said, she mostly stopped trying and just kept walking, kept watching, kept turning the problem over in her head because that's what her mind did with problems like that, whether anyone wanted her opinion or not. That brings us to the Thursday night that changed everything. The fog that night was heavier than usual, thick enough that visibility along that perimeter road had dropped considerably. The kind of night where a patrol running its normal loop has to work a little harder to actually see anything clearly at all. A young airman named Specialist Marcus Webb was running that patrol route, alone, in a vehicle, doing the same loop he'd done dozens of times before, expecting, if he expected anything at all, another quiet, uneventful night. What made that night different wasn't the fog. It was that Diane, according to her own account, had reached a point where she genuinely couldn't keep carrying what she knew without saying something, one more time, to whoever happened to drive past. When Webb's vehicle came around the bend near that same stretch of fence line, she stepped toward the road, not aggressively, not suddenly, but deliberately enough that he had to stop. According to Webb's own account, given later in an official statement, his first instinct was exactly the one 6 weeks of reports had trained into every single patrol on that route. Another sighting of the same transient, Note it. Move on. But something in how she spoke stopped him before he could pull away. She didn't ask for money, didn't ask for help. She simply said, calmly and with a precision that Webb later described as immediately, unmistakably different from anything he'd have expected, "Your sensor coverage has a gap between towers 4 and 5, roughly 60 meters past the tree line, and I think someone could get through it without tripping anything." Webb, by his own admission, almost drove off anyway. It's worth being honest about that, because I think it's an important part of this story. 6 weeks of institutional assumption doesn't just disappear because someone says something specific, but something about the exact technical way she'd phrased it, tower numbers, distance estimates, the specific mention of sensor coverage rather than something vaguer, made him pause long enough to actually ask her a follow-up question instead of driving away. And once he asked, she kept going. She described, in language that Webb, despite having zero technical security background himself, recognized immediately as coming from someone who genuinely understood these systems, exactly how the sensor placement in that section created a blind angle relative to the tree line, and exactly how someone with basic knowledge of the system could time a crossing to exploit it. She wasn't guessing. She was explaining, the way a professional explains something they've spent years actually working with. Webb, to his considerable credit, made a decision in that moment that ended up mattering enormously. Instead of dismissing her, he radioed it up the chain, flagging what she'd told him as specific and detailed enough to warrant an actual look, even though he had absolutely no way to independently verify anything she was claiming, and even though everything in 6 weeks of prior reports told him this woman wasn't worth taking that seriously. What happened over the following 4 hours became, almost immediately, one of the more significant security findings that base had on record in recent memory. A response team dispatched to the section of fence line Diane had described found exactly what she'd told Webb they'd find: a genuine, previously unidentified gap in sensor coverage created by a combination of the terrain dip and recent construction on the neighboring property that had gone unaccounted for in the system's maintenance records, precisely where and precisely how she'd described it. The technical team that conducted the follow-up assessment in the days afterward confirmed that the vulnerability was real, exploitable, and had, as far as anyone could determine, gone completely unnoticed by the base's own security engineering staff, the exact kind of blind spot that exists specifically because it doesn't show up in any of the standard diagnostic checks unless you know, from first-hand engineering experience, precisely what to look for from outside the system rather than within it. I want you to sit with the weight of that for a second. A homeless woman, walking a fence line at night because she had nowhere else stable to be, had identified a genuine security vulnerability at a major airbase that the base's own trained security staff had missed. Not through luck, not through some vague intuition. Through 2 decades of exact, hard-won professional expertise that 6 weeks of homelessness and institutional dismissal had done absolutely nothing to erase. Base leadership, once the finding was confirmed and its significance became clear, moved quickly, and to their genuine credit, moved in the right direction. Rather than simply patching the vulnerability and quietly moving on, the base's security director insisted on personally meeting Diane, wanting to understand exactly how someone with her background had ended up walking that fence line in the first place. That conversation, according to 2 people present for at least part of it, was reportedly a difficult one for everyone involved, in the specific way that honest conversations about how systems fail people usually are. Diane explained her background plainly, without much self-pity, laying out the chain of circumstances that had taken her from 2 decades of specialized security engineering work to 6 weeks of being logged night after night as an unnamed transient by the very kind of installation she'd once helped protect. The security director, according to those same witnesses, didn't try to smooth over the discomfort of that gap. He acknowledged it directly, and then did something that mattered considerably more than an apology would have. He offered her formal consulting work, on the spot, reviewing the base's broader perimeter security systems for exactly the kind of blind spots she'd just proven she was uniquely equipped to find. Work that came with real pay, real credentials, and the kind of respect that 6 weeks of patrol reports had never once extended to her. Diane accepted, and over the following months, according to people who worked with her during that engagement, she identified 2 additional, smaller vulnerabilities elsewhere on the base's perimeter, using the exact same combination of careful, patient observation and deep technical expertise that had first flagged the gap near Towers 4 and 5. Her work eventually led to a broader contract, considerably more stable than the position she'd lost 8 months earlier, and, just as importantly, considerably more stable housing than the 6 weeks that had led her to that fence line in the first place. What stays with me most about this story isn't really the 4 hours it took to confirm what she'd found, remarkable as that discovery was. It's the 6 weeks before it, 6 weeks of a genuinely brilliant security engineer being logged, night after night, as background noise, as a problem to note and move past, rather than a person worth a single real conversation. Nobody on that base was trying to be cruel. They were simply doing exactly what 6 weeks of institutional pattern matching had trained them to do, and in doing it, they very nearly missed a genuine security vulnerability that sat right in front of them the entire time, described, patiently, repeatedly, by the one person on that entire base who actually understood what she was looking at. So here's my question for you tonight, and I want your honest answer in the comments. Do you think Specialist Webb deserves real credit for actually stopping and listening that night, even though it took him 6 weeks of prior sightings to finally do it? Or do you think the real failure here belongs entirely to the 5 weeks and 6 days before that, when patrol after patrol looked directly at her and never once asked a real question? And tell me the other thing too. Before I told you her background, had you already started suspecting that this transient was going to turn out to be something else entirely? If this story kept you here tonight, subscribe before you go, because this channel exists entirely for exactly this kind of story. The ones who get looked past, again and again, until the moment they absolutely cannot be looked past anymore. And if there's a story like Diane's sitting somewhere in your own life, or something you've heard that reminds you of it, tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. I'll see you in the next one.